Hello, I'm very pleased to speak to you, the Gary community. My objective today is to start building a bridge of solidarity and empowerment. We have much in common than it appears to common sense. We will talk about racism, discrimination, and social exclusion. The problems of Black people in the US are very similar to our problems in Brazil, and together we are stronger. Yet you started your fight earlier than us. The Black movement in Brazil started to be recognized only in the early 90s with a democratic constitution. Nevertheless, after a democratic period with social development and legal improvement to ban racism and discrimination, Brazil lives a backlash since 2016. Our history is very similar to the history of all Latin American countries. Brazil was built on the shoulders of slavery and the exploitation of natural resources. In fact, plunder the land, slavery, and destruction of peoples, cultures, and nature are the components of a still very active system, which is colonialism. To give you an idea, in Brazil, the Europeans arrived in the 1500s and tried to subjugate the First Nations with little success. At the same time, started to transfer nature to Europe, beginning with a tree called Brazil. The name of our country is the mark of colonialism. The first Black slaves arrived in Brazil between 1539 and 1542 in the Capitany of Pernambuco, where the sugarcane culture was effectively developed. Over more than 3 centuries, Portuguese or Brazilian ships embarked slaves in nearly 90 African ports, making more than 11,400 slave trips. Of these, 9,200 went to Brazil. Brazil was the country that most received slaves in Americas. 4 out of 10 blacks who crossed the Atlantic until the second half of the 19th century had our country as their destination. A total of 4.8 million Africans came to Brazil. In 2015, the United Nations recognized the Valongo Wharf as a World Heritage. In 1811, a stone wharf was built there for the arrival of ships. About 1 million slaves are estimated to have entered through this place. Only through this place. Brazil was the last state to abolish slavery. It was in 1888 with a simple act. Overnight, there was a change from slavery to the abandonment on the streets. Nothing was granted. Without money, nor education or housing, Black slaves became the bottom of Brazilian society. They got the ambitioned freedom, but did they got the freedom? Brazil was starting its industrialization, and slavery was not compatible with the logic of capitalism. So, after the Freedom Act, instead of assimilating the former slaves as employees, the government started a policy receiving migrants from Europe who even received land to cultivate in the south part of Brazil. And this make the slave situation, the former slave situation, until worse. Afro-American people were always associated with slavery who didn't deserve a salary, nor even a piece of land. After a century, a new constitution written with the end of a dictatorship guaranteed the property of land occupied by former slaves who have fled from farmers and built their community, called quilombos. Also, this constitution condemned racism and declared it as a no-bail crime. Only in 2003, a Brazilian act prescribes the duty of teaching Afro-Brazilian teaching and culture at schools. The racial quotas to universities in Brazil started only in 2004, and it was not an easy task. But after all, after 15 years, the universities in Brazil started the real change. Between 2010 and 2019, the number of Black students in higher education grew by almost 400%. Afro-descendants reached 38% of the total enrolled, a percentage is still below its representation in the population as a whole of 56%, but it is still a beginning. I must say that the real meaning of structural racism can be found in Brazil. It's really a shame that Brazil spread the idea of a racial democracy and a state where discrimination was unknown. This is false. It is just like the pig's proclamation in the novel of Animal Farm by George Orwell. You know, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. It's the same what we in Brazil when we talk about racism. The white people used to say there is no racism in Brazil, but Black people don't deserve to have the same rights as us white people. So, in fact, racism is so rooted in Brazil that it is invisible. Better saying, it was invisible. Consciousness and anti-racism movement grew hand in hand with quotas. That's the reason why it is so important to highlight the beginning of these quotas in the universities in Brazil. It truly changed the scenario of a fight and the anti-racism fight. It shows that education is the big door to equality and justice. But the numbers are still scary in Brazil. In 2021, our Federal Institute of Statistics declared that Brazilian is 56% of Black people, but they are 67% of prison population, 75% of poorest in Brazil are Black, whereas 70% of the richest are white people. Well, I would like to say that we are on the path of paying our historical debt. But it's partially true. The coup d'etat we suffered in Brazil in 2016 stepped down the first woman president in Brazil and empowered the ugliest side of our country, especially racism. But there is a chance to fight back. It is the awareness. It is time to fight colonialism. America, and I speak about Americas, the holy continent, where slaves were brought to serve men, has a sad history. Occupation, murder, slavery, plunder are the names of industrial development. One of the worst achievements of colonialism is the colonization of our body and mind. The destruction of identities is followed by the model of the so-called Western civilization. Anywhere, anytime, the Western way of life is advertised as the only one to lead to happiness and success. But in fact, instead of deliver democracy, it segregates, closes the eyes to corruption and to social injustice. Instead, to build prosperity, it spread the destruction of human lives and nature. Instead, to create a place of happiness, it achieved a society with a high level of mental illness. The change of this reality may be summarized in a word: decolonization. It's much more difficult than we think, but it is all about building healthy, sustainable relationships among humans and the planet. We must recover the cultures smashed by the violence of colonization. The indigenous peoples and their knowledge and spirituality are very important to a new society with more equity and justice. The African wisdom summarized in the expression Ubuntu means I am because we are, is very important to fight against individualism. We must understand that the change is in the daily action and in the social political organization as well. The history of Gary community is not different from the communities in Brazil that suffer from private and public violence and injustice. Knowing more about ourselves, our roots, and about the thousands of people who suffer the same oppression is an act of resistance and empowerment. I embrace you and I wish we could meet in person one day. Have a good day.